Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Welcome to Coast AM, the very best in late-night talk radio. I'm Richard Serrett, and this morning, I'm coming to you live from my home studio in Old Thornhill, just north of Toronto. Many of you reached out to me via email or on Twitter, X, and asked for some photos of my son's new pet ducklings, Toopy and Binu. And so I posted a couple of those on Twitter, or X if you'd rather, at Richard Serrett. Not much new to report in terms of the duckies, except that they're growing incredibly fast. They're starting to resemble tiny dinosaurs. And this afternoon, they went for their first swim in the boys' bathtub. Later, they ate an entire can of chickpeas and lounged in the family room watching TV with my mother-in-law. I think they watched a Humphrey Bogart movie on Turner Classic Movies. Lots of very positive feedback on last night's show with Raymond Hicks, the former deputy with the Broward County Sheriff's Department, who tried to blow the whistle on corrupt cops in the drug squad. And then he ended up being framed for drug trafficking himself and doing 16 months in jail for his trouble. Raymond Hicks refused a plea bargain deal, survived attempts on his life when he was placed in the prison's general population, where it's open season on cops. Eventually, he got his day in court, beat the charges, but essentially lost his career and his home. And it's all, of course, chronicled in his book, I'm Still Standing, which I expect to see Ray's story up on the big screen or perhaps on Netflix in the not-too-distant future. Anyway, it was very disheartening to hear from Raymond that many of the crooked cops who worked alongside him on the drug squad, who attempted to silence him, were promoted and still work in the Broward County Sheriff's Department. I believe one caller last night described Broward County as the Wild West. Let's hope the state of Florida's Attorney General gets involved and cleans things up there. All right, here's what we have for you on Coast to Coast AM tonight. Sharing his more than 3 decades of research into the afterlife and paranormal phenomena, award-winning documentary filmmaker Daniel Drazen will be here to reveal how the continuity of human consciousness beyond the physical body and after death constitutes a legitimate area of scientific inquiry, and that it can be objectively demonstrated. Drazen begins by revealing how our belief in materialism, through its effects on our social norms, taboos, and even language, has deeply constrained our civilization's understanding of the nature of space, time, life, death, and consciousness. However, as Daniel explains, our deeply ingrained cultural habits tied to materialism have begun to change. In his new book, he explores 15 promising post-materialist scientific investigations currently underway, focusing in depth on 3 examples that offer the most objectively irrefutable evidence for the survival of consciousness, including electronic audio and visual communications from the other side, the groundbreaking 5-year Skoll experiment in physical mediumship, and the profoundly evidential reincarnation case of James Leninger. Daniel Drazen will be here in hours 1 and 2. Edward Theodore Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Ghoul, was an American murderer and body snatcher. Gein's crimes, committed around his hometown of Plainfield, Wisconsin, gathered widespread notoriety in 1957 after authorities discovered he had exhumed corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and keepsakes from their bones and skin. Gein also confessed to killing 2 women, tavern owner Mary Hogan in 1954, and hardware store owner Bernice Worden in 1957. Gein's heinous crimes inspired the films Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he also inspired the character Buffalo Bill in the movie Silence of the Lambs, who targets female victims, starving them after their capture so that their skin is easy to remove when he kills them. Sounds like the perfect subject matter for a musical, doesn't it? Actually, I'm not kidding. Dan Davies is an actor, screenplay writer, and producer. He wrote, co-produced, and starred in the comedy film Ed Gein, the musical, in 2010, about the cannibalistic murderer and grave robber. The film critic at the Arizona Daily Star described the film as deliciously tasteless. Dan Davies will be here to discuss Ed Gein, the Plainfield Ghoul, as well as his film, Ed Gein the Musical. Davies is also a publisher, and his publishing company just published a new book by former Deputy Coroner Donna Francart, titled Ed Gein the Musical, a Novel. Dan Davies and Donna Francart join me in hours 3 and 4. Daniel Drazen is next to discuss a new science of the afterlife. Welcome to the audio imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler. Hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather round the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. I'm Richard Serrett, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Why don't you stay a while? Daniel Drazen is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and has been a photographer and a media producer for more than 6 decades. Since the early 1990s, as featured in his documentary Calling Earth, Daniel has been actively investigating the field of afterlife communication through traditional mental and physical mediumship, as well as modern electronics. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and his brand new book is A Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code. Daniel Drazen, welcome to Coast AM. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I want to start off with John Keel. You were colleagues, and I had heard this story about John Keel, and people who are familiar with this, perhaps one of the world's most influential ufologists, journalists, paranormal researcher. I'd heard this story years ago, but I had no idea until you and I met several months ago and talked about it, that you were also involved in this remarkable paranormal supernatural incident. So first of all, just maybe begin by telling us how you connected initially with John Keel, and then we'll get into this remarkable incident.
Okay, well, this was back in the mid-1960s. I was living in New York City at the time, and I found myself one day up at a place called the Cloisters, which is a beautiful museum of medieval art that's located on the Upper West Side overlooking the Hudson River. And as I was up there, I noticed a looking out over the river towards the Palisades of New Jersey, I noticed a kind of a funny-looking flying object that was flying in a northerly direction. And having been a student pilot at the time, this object attracted my attention, and particularly attracted my attention when it stopped and reversed its direction instantaneously. That was, I suppose, my very first actual UFO sighting. I had been interested in the subject for many years, but this had been my first actual experience of seeing something an aerial object that I could not explain. So I mentioned it to a friend of mine who said, "Oh, there's this writer, John Keel, who's giving a talk tomorrow. Why don't you go to his talk and discuss your sighting with him?" So I did, and long story short, we became friends. He at the time was had just begun to investigate the phenomena that were going on in Point Pleasant, West Virginia.
The Mothman, right?
The Mothman, primarily the Mothman, but also a variety of other fascinating and sometimes disturbing phenomena. Anyway, I accompanied John on 4 of his trips to Point Pleasant, met quite a number of witnesses there who had seen the Mothman and the other phenomena, which included UFOs that flew over the town and up and down the river. That's Point Pleasant. Point Pleasant is located right on the Ohio River, where the Ohio and the Kanawha rivers come together. At the time, the two states were connected by a bridge that had been built in the 1920s. It was called the Silver Bridge because it was at that time a novel, very lightweight aluminum construction, and it was in a way Point Pleasant's main source of economic support, because the bridge came right over the river, right into the downtown business district of Point Pleasant. So it was a sort of a major feature of the town. So it was kind of a crossroads of that part of the country. Anyway, people there had been reporting seeing this quite startling creature there for a period of time. Notably, two adolescent couples who were out canoodling one night in one of their automobiles out in a forested area. And when they heard a disturbance around them, they turned their headlights on, and lo and behold, there was this 7 or 8 foot tall creature with big glowing red eyes and wings that levitated off the ground. It startled these kids. They put the car in gear and skedaddled, went down the main highway. This creature followed them, hovering, flying over their car. And as they approached the lights of the town, the creature sort of peeled off and disappeared. So they reported this terrifying incident to the local sheriff's department, which it turns out had received quite a number of other reports of sightings of this creature. Nobody knew what it was, where it was from. It was missing from the annals of cryptozoology as far as anyone knew. It was quite a unique kind of creature. It wasn't a Bigfoot or anything like that. So anyway, long story short, dozens of people saw this creature. I spoke to a private pilot at an airport across the river in Ohio who had seen this thing in flight. And he says, well, at first I thought it was some kind of a small airplane, and I got closer to it, and my God, it was this flying critter. And this guy's salt of the earth, local private pilot. He didn't impress me as making the story up. So while I did not myself see this creature, I certainly have no doubt that it existed. People had very strong emotional responses to encountering it, sometimes in broad daylight. Actually at all hours of the day and night in that general area. Now, when I say that general area, I'm talking about the Ohio River area, mostly north of the town of Point Pleasant, which actually has a history of paranormal phenomena going back at least into the last century. There were tales about a Native American chief called Chief Cornstalk having put a curse of some kind on the land.
Right.
People believe that this was, partly the cause of some of these phenomena. Now, not only was the Mothman seen, but as you probably know, a number of individuals were witnesses to the so-called Men in Black. And
yes.
These were what I guess ufologists would consider the classic Men in Black. They were kind of a swarthy complexion, dressed in dark business suits, and they would often show up driving vintage automobiles from maybe 20, 30 years in the past, looking brand new as if they'd just come off the assembly line. And they would either subtly or very directly threaten people to not talk about their experiences. And I never personally witnessed them, but I spoke to a number of people who had. One of them was one of the kids who had first sighted the Mothman, and that on that terrifying evening. She and her boyfriend eventually married, and they had a young child. And one day, these Men in Black showed up in a vintage Buick limousine, with carrying an old sort of 1940s vintage press camera and offering to photograph their child. And this is something that John Keel had run into in the past, an utterly bizarre kind of situation. These strange guys were sent away, and they never came back. They never made good on any sort of threats. So, what are these things about? And a question that I ask about a lot of paranormal phenomena, or so-called paranormal phenomena, including the whole question of an afterlife, is this really paranormal? Do these things go on much more frequently? Do people have these experiences much more frequently than we give them credit for? Is our social norms really responsible for the definition paranormal or supernatural? When we say supernatural, what are the limits of nature? We think something is supernatural. We're sort of arbitrarily putting limits on nature. Maybe the whole thing is natural. So this gets into some of what I get into in my book about language.
Right, but I just wanted to get to the incident. It was I believe just before or just after the collapse of the Silver Bridge, and you're in New York with John Keel, and he receives a visitor. Right.
Okay. Let me just go back a little bit. On our last trip to Point Pleasant, prior to this particular day, John was given a sort of a prophecy by a psychic woman in the town, and it was to the effect that she said that there will be a disaster on the river the night that President Johnson lights the White House Christmas tree. So on that particular night, in December of 1967, John and I were back in New York. I was at my home, he was at his, and we agreed that I would come up to his place. We'd turn on the TV, watch the news reports, and see if anything happened on the Ohio River. So I go up to John's place, and he lets me in, and he introduces me to a friend of his, a guy named Joe, who has been an old friend of John's. But John hadn't seen him in years and had sort of lost contact with him. And yet Joe appeared at John's door on this very interesting and unusual evening. So I met Joe, big guy. I'm about 6'1". He's at least 6'2". Strong guy, dark hair, mustache. Looks as if he was in his late 40s.
You shook his hand.
I shook his hand, and the thing about it was one of the strongest handshakes I've ever experienced. The guy was really strong. And anyway, we chatted for a while. We turned the TV on. There was no news. So John and Joe went out to dinner, and they actually went to a UFO conference that was held in Manhattan that evening. I went back home. Got home, turned my TV on. Just at that moment, the network feed was interrupted from the news from Point Pleasant, that the Silver Bridge had collapsed into the Ohio River in the middle of this was a Christmas season rush hour traffic. It was a huge tragedy. There wasn't anyone in the town who didn't know someone who was killed in that collapse.
Right.
And so that that's a part of the Mothman story that everyone seems to know. It was featured in the Richard Gere movie, which is a very, very loose adaptation of the story. But the interesting thing was that I didn't think much more of this fellow Joe that I met until John found out a couple of years later that Joe had been dead for 2 years. When we met.
Prior to your meeting, Joe.
Yes. And following that meeting, Joe was untraceable. John tried to reach him. His phone was disconnected and so on. And the only way he found out about this was a couple of years later, he happened to be in Macy's department store and ran into Joe's wife. And I said, "Oh, hi, how's Joe? I saw him 2 years ago. I haven't been able to find him." And she said, "Oh, don't mess with me, John. Joe's been dead for 5 years."
Oh, wow. That gets me every time.
And so on. He died in my presence, and I went to his funeral and all that, of course. So now I had read.
Daniel, pardon the interruption. I got to jump in here because we're approaching the bottom of the hour, and we're going to take a quick time out. You shook his hand. He was dead. You shook his hand. Back with more of my conversation with Daniel Drazen right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Say hello on Twitter or X at Richard Serrett. S-Y, because I love you, R-E-T-T. Lifting the veil. That's what we're doing tonight, lifting the veil. An experiment to produce oxygen on Mars has concluded successfully and surpassed NASA's initial goals. Over the course of 2 years, a device on the Perseverance rover called MOXIE, which stands for Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment, generated 122 grams of oxygen, equivalent to what a small dog breathes in 10 hours. MOXIE works by converting Mars' abundant carbon dioxide into oxygen. The device demonstrated remarkable efficiency, producing 12 grams of oxygen an hour at 98% purity, double NASA's target. Trudy Cortez, Director of Technology Demonstrations at NASA, stated, "By proving this technology in real-world conditions, we've come one step closer to a future in which astronauts can live off the land on the red planet." Wow. You can read more of this story and see some pretty cool pictures in the carousel up at coasttocoastam.com. Back to more of my conversation with Daniel Drazen, the author of A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Daniel Drazen is with us, award-winning documentary filmmaker, and his new book is A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code. And before the break, Daniel, you were telling us about how you met John Keel's mysterious friend Joe, and this was in New York, the very night that the Silver Bridge collapsed, of course, tied to the Mothman prophecies, which John wrote about. When you learned from John Keel that this mysterious Joe that you met, that you shook hands with, that he went out to dinner with and went to a UFO conference, only to discover a year later that Joe had been dead for years when you met him. What went through your mind at that moment?
Well, honestly, what went through my mind, Richard, was that I had heard many accounts of so-called materializations of folks who had passed. I had been skeptical of them, but I was a skeptic no more after meeting Joe and finding out that he was, in fact, had materialized himself. We don't know how this works or how it happens, but it was one of the things that inspired me to inquire into the whole question of the afterlife. Now, I've been interested in all kinds of so-called paranormal areas for much of my life, but I hadn't really dug deeply into the area of scientific investigation into the afterlife. This all changed for me in the mid-1990s when I happened to be living in Boulder, Colorado at the time, and met a guy named Mark Macy. Mark had been practicing and involved in the research of what's known as instrumental transcommunication, which means communication from the other side through modern electronics. I was at first a little skeptical of this, and so is the CIA getting into people's tape recorders and causing mischief, that sort of thing? But my skepticism quickly dissolved when I found out that this practice and this research has a long history. It actually began, as far as we know, back in the 1950s, when tape recorders first became consumer items. And people were using their recorders for all kinds of things. You're recording birthday party celebrations and music and so on. And what a few people noticed on their tapes now and then was the presence of mysterious voices that didn't seem to belong there. Now, in the United States, this was not taken particularly seriously. People theorized that, well, maybe the machine was picking up signals from a strong radio station nearby, and that sort of thing can happen. It's called radio pickup. But no one really paid much attention to it or took it seriously. In Europe, it was a different story. a number of researchers and physicists and so on started experimenting with this. The real pioneer in this field was a man named Friedrich Jürgensen, who was a Swede, very well known in his time as an artist, documentary producer, even an opera singer. He was a multi-talented individual. And one night he was out with his new tape recorder, recording nocturnal bird sounds for a documentary film he was making. When he played back the tape, in between the bird sounds, he heard faint voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds. He thought this was quite a coincidence at first, and he sort of kind of dismissed it. But then not long after that, he heard the voice of his deceased mother calling him by his childhood nickname, Friedel.
Wow.
That got his attention.
I'll bet.
And actually, this turns out to be a sort of a tradition that people who discover this phenomenon often starts for them with the voice of a relative calling them by a childhood nickname or something that no one else would know. Anyway, at this point, Jürgensen kind of threw up his hands and said, "Well, this is real, and we need to start investigating it scientifically." So this began many years of research on his part, practicing, simply experimenting, rolling the tape, asking questions, leaving blank spaces on the tape, asking more questions, and so on. And when he played the tape back, in those gaps where there should have been only silence, he heard faint but meaningful answers to his questions.
Have you captured an EVP, an A grade or a grade A EVP yourself?
I have not. I'm more of a journalist than a practitioner. I have had interesting electronic phenomena go on around me, but I've never actually captured an EVP voice myself. But I've met many people who have. And as you can see in my film, Calling Earth, I'll give you the link for that later. This is not an uncommon phenomenon. Another pattern that has developed over the years is that experimenters who themselves have passed over then show up in their colleagues' recordings and electronic equipment. This includes both audio and visual technology. There's a young guy in the Netherlands, Robert Vandenbroek, who you can hand him your camera or your phone, and he can point it at the wall and knock off a half a dozen photos. And there's a fair chance that in those photos there will be pictures of deceased individuals and others, but images that should not be there at all under the circumstances. I visited him back in 2014, I think it was, and I set up a very rigid protocol to make sure there was no possibility of trickery. And he produced 4 images on a camera that I had provided with my own memory cards and so on that I kept very close track of. He produced 4 images. One of them looks like it was a kind of a vague outline that looked like a profile of my father. I can't prove that.
Wow.
It really looked like him. And then 2 images of what was clearly Friedrich Jürgensen, the gentleman that I mentioned a few moments ago, who was one of the discoverers of this phenomenon. And these images were such that it would have taken, a talented painter or Photoshop artist a considerable time to produce because of the subtle distortions and so on. These were not photographic likenesses, but they were creations, as best I can express it. Very, very fascinating to me, and you can see these in my film as well.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
What do you make of the I've seen entire books dedicated to sort of Victorian or Edwardian photographs of physical mediums producing ectoplasm.
Right.
What do you make of those photos? Some of them are obviously frauds,
Right.
but others, what do you make of them?
I haven't had the resources to really dig up the originals of those photos and analyze them. I would agree that some of them seem quite legitimate. Others it's certainly possible that they were manipulated, and others I would say are definitely manipulated. For example, one of the techniques would be to set up, say, a portrait of a couple in a portrait studio, and then later on in the darkroom superimpose the image of a deceased individual. Now, the tip-off there was that the original photo was composed to allow the space for the deceased individual to appear.
Right.
So the whole thing is, is highly suspect. It's really difficult to go back, 100, 150 years and analyze these things. All I can say is that any professional photographer could look at most of these photos and tell a fake from a possible.
I always associate sort of physical mediumship with Edwardian England, but there was, tell us about this physical mediumship experiment, the Skoll experiment. This went on for 5 years. This is fairly recent, right?
Right. This took place in the latter part of the 1990s. It was a departure from traditional physical mediumship in that ectoplasm was not involved. It was apparently a direct energy connection between this side and the other side, if you want to put it that way. It involved two couples on this side who met for 500 sessions over a period of 5 years in the basement of a 17th century farmhouse in the English town of Skoll. It's a tiny town about half-hour northeast of Cambridge. And this house was built in the 17th century, and it had this wonderful below-ground cellar, probably originally a wine cellar of some kind, but it provided a measure of quiet, sort of radio silence down there as well. And these two couples met, as I say, over a period of about 5 years, and both couples had been involved in mediumship of one sort or another. One couple, they were mental mediums, very talented mental mediums. The other couple were researchers, Robin and Sandra Foy. And together they worked with a team on the other side who came through their voices came through the mental mediums. They set up a dialogue. And through this dialogue, they worked out experiments to produce a huge variety, in the end, of physical phenomena. There were photographic experiments, experiments with video, and experiments with apports. In the lexicon of physical mediumship, an apport is a physical object that appears in the room, presumably brought from some distant point in time and space. Over the period of the experiment, they acquired quite a number of these things, including two British newspapers that had been published in the middle 1940s, actually during wartime, and they actually had the newsprint, the paper stock, examined by the Paper Industry Research Association, who analyzed it and said, yes, this is the genuine article. This paper was produced during wartime because it had a unique chemical signature. Now,
you held one in your hand, didn't you?
I did, and it was really interesting because, and this is about 5 years after it was said to have arrived, and the outer pages had begun to yellow, as old newspaper will, but the inside pages were pure white, as if the paper had just come off the press. So this was quite an experience. What else? They did some wonderful photographic experiments. They were at one point instructed by their spirit team to put a conventional camera on their table, and by this is in total darkness, except that there were precautions done. Everyone wore luminous wristbands so people's hand movements could be seen, and there were luminous tabs applied to every movable object in the room. So manipulation and fraud was virtually impossible for that and other reasons, which we can go into later. But anyway, they were asked to put this camera on the table loaded with 35 millimeter color film, and during their session, the camera was heard to levitate and float around the room with the shutter clicking, and then the camera landed back on the table. When the film was developed, on the film were 11 perfectly framed black and white photographs, which they were told were actually copies of photos that existed somewhere in the world. which the Skull folks were actually able to track down, some of them anyway.
Remarkable.
And they were told that the reason that these were copies was that it was easier for them to do this than to create their own original imagery. But that eventually occurred. They were asked then to put just simply the roll of film directly on the table. And once that film was developed, there was a huge variety of fascinating and interesting material on those films.
Wasn't there a poem from a 19th century, I don't know, Wordsworth or something that was sort of a reworking? Yeah.
Right. Yes, it was a variation on one of his famous poems called Ruth, and it was signed by him on this film. There was also, in one of their, they also did electronic voice experiments, and when they asked the Spirit team how this could be improved, on one of these films, they received a diagram, electronic diagram of how to produce a device to enhance the electronic communications. And this diagram was signed with the initials TAE. So after doing a little research, they found that this was the signature of Thomas A. Edison. It matched it perfectly. They also received other signatures of famous people, deceased artists and performers, and a Victorian medium, and so on, and also images and photographic images of some of these people, and were able to track down who they were and verify them with their next of kin and so on. So all this material was highly evidential. One of the most interesting and evidential aspects of this whole project was that it was monitored for 2 years by a team of properly skeptical investigators from the British Society for Psychical Research in London, and these three very, very careful investigators spent 2 solid years attending these skull sessions. And at no time could they find any evidence of trickery or fraud.
Wow, that's remarkable. I mean, that's central to the scientific method, right? Is an experiment that is repeatable, and they did this for over 5 years. Daniel, we have to take another time out as we roll into the top of the hour. Daniel Drazen is the author of A New Science of the Afterlife, Space-Time and the Consciousness Code. We'll find out what the consciousness code is on the other side. The other side on Coast to Coast AM.